Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. So, the defence of the Suez Canal. I'd just like to share a rundown of the tour, what we're going to go through. We'll start with a very brief history of the canal before looking at its place in British strategy. I want to dive it very briefly to look at the Indian Army because it's the Indian Army that do the defending of the canal. We'll look at life in Egypt. We'll look at the canal defences itself in the First World War, the Ottoman capabilities, the attack itself, and obviously the defense, and then a very, very brief finish looking at the aftermath. When it was opened in November 1869, the Suez Canal measured 102 miles long. It was 26 feet deep and flowing through the larger Lake Timseh and Great Bitter Lake with a series of bypasses to allow ships to pass each other. And it's quite a good quiz question that there are no locks on the Suez Canal. The purpose of the canal was to connect the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, creating a shorter route for maritime communication, trade, and travel, which would usually have taken the much longer route around the Cape of Good Hope. The canal shortened the route from the Arabian Sea to London by approximately 5,500 miles. And this took roughly 10 days at 20 knots or 8 days at 24 knots. So it shortened the distance by shortened the time of travel by quite a lot. Developer was the Frenchman Fernand de Lesseps, was the driving force behind the canal's creation. In 1858, de Lesseps and his Universal Suez Ship Canal Company struck a deal with then Khedive, or Viceroy of Egypt, which eventually saw Egypt bankrupt. As Europeans profited from the canal, Egypt suffered. Rather than bring Egypt wealth, the Suez Canal brought the country rising international debt. Egypt was forced to sell its shares in the canal to Britain. This payment only eased Egypt's troubles for a short time, and by 1876 the country was bankrupt. Britain had initially been sceptical about investing in de Lesseps Canal. Whilst on an official visit to the Isthmus in 1869, the Prince of Wales expressed his disappointment that Lord Palmerston's government had not supported the canal, given its importance for communication with India. 6 years later, when passing through the completed canal, the Prince of Wales repeated his opinion and stated that the canal was the highway to India. But Britain's late interest in the canal was much to its benefit. Purchasing Egypt's shares in the canal gave them a majority shareholder at a rock-bottom price. Bankruptcy saw the European powers take control of Egypt's finances. This loss of independence proved unpopular. The country had spent the 19th century moving itself away from the Ottoman Empire, which it was still nominally a part of, only to then come under the control of Britain and France through mismanagement. Riots ensued. In 1881, Colonel Ahmed Arabi headed a revolt which aimed to overthrow both the Khedive and remove the foreign influence from Egypt. What followed, though, was a short, efficient campaign led by the modern Major General himself, Sir Garnet Wolseley, to put down the Egyptian revolt, culminating in the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. Victory left Britain in control of Egypt. Several punch cartoons of the period show Britain's control of Egypt, and thus the canal, as holding the key to India, which was, of course, the crown in the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. One man who found himself in Egypt and the neighbouring Sudan after Britain took control of the region was Lord Kitchener. Kitchener had several roles within the Egyptian army, becoming Sardar, or Commander-in-Chief, in 1892. In this role, he oversaw reform of the Egyptian army into a much more efficient, modern fighting force, a process he would then later attempt to imitate in India. As Sardar, Kitchener led the reconquest of the Sudan and then served as Governor-General of the Sudan until 1899, at which point he headed for South Africa. He became Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army between 1902 until 1909. In the last decade of the 19th century and first decade of the 20th century, the defence of the canal was planned in the event of war with either France or Russia. It was calculated that there would be an interval of at least 4 days between any declaration of war and the arrival of an invading army. The British aim would be to hold Alexandria for as long as was possible and then retreat to Cairo. To meet such a threat, the British kept a garrison of a little over 4,000 troops in Egypt, and these were accompanied by the Egyptian army, which was in peacetime 13,000 strong. For Kitchener, it was always important that his spiritual home, Egypt, should be well defended in order to defend Britain's prized possession, India. At a conference in 1902, for example, he suggested raising 4 new Sudanese battalions under British officers to add to the force that defended the canal should a war break out. Kitchener was keen to see the canal more strongly defended so that lines to India be kept open. As Secretary of State for War, Kitchener watched the Ottoman Empire closely. He feared an Ottoman declaration of war would stir up pan-Islamic sentiment, and he was almost certain that one of the Ottomans' first moves would be against the Suez Canal. On the 9th of August 1914, orders were received from the War Office that 2 infantry divisions and the cavalry division were to be dispatched from India to Egypt. The purpose of these Indian units was to relieve the British units in Egypt, freeing them up to return to Britain and then on to France. Just 9 days later, new orders were received. The 2 Indian infantry divisions, which were 3rd Lahore and 7th Meerut Division, were to go straight to Marseille, stopping at Egypt only briefly. For political reasons, it was decided to send Indian troops to the Western Front, rather than leave them languishing on garrison duty. It was hoped that this would increase support for the war in India. The British garrison was still to be relieved, but by a territorial division. The commander in Egypt at this time was Major General Julian Byng. Byng, though, was very quickly recalled to Britain and was replaced by the man on screen, Sir John Maxwell. Maxwell had spent the majority of his military career in Egypt after 1882. Commanding the British forces there between 1908 and 1912, he was well acquainted with all aspects of the country. That said, though, we're probably more familiar with Maxwell now for his role in putting down the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916. As Commander-in-Chief Ireland at the time, it was Maxwell who gave the order for the leaders of the revolt to be executed. On the 19th of September, the 3rd Lahore Division sailed from Alexandria to Marseille. It had arrived in Egypt on the 8th of September. Given that it was quiet in Egypt, Maxwell had allowed the division to continue its journey to Europe, as per the War Office request. The 9th Sir Hind Brigade, though, was left behind and was sent to guard the canal. Soon after, the Territorial East Lancashire Division, which would later be known as the 42nd, arrived in Egypt. Alongside the East Lancashires were the Hertfordshire Yeomanry and the Westminster Dragoons. These yeoman cavalry were replacing the 3rd Dragoon Guards, who had been dispatched to the Western Front. In early October, Kitchener began to press Maxwell for the release of the Sir Hind Brigade. But the Sir Hind Brigade were the only fully trained soldiers presently in Egypt. This concerned Maxwell. Reports were being received from across the Sinai of repairs being made to roads and rails in Gaza, and of German officers being sighted at frontier posts. Maxwell was permitted to retain the 9th Sir Hind Brigade until the 22nd Lucknow Brigade arrived from India to replace them. Maxwell was also made aware that the East Lancashire Division were rapidly improving. The Ottoman Empire declared war on the 28th of October 1914. The East Lancashire Division was paraded through the streets of Cairo to impress the inhabitants. A number of prominent Turkish subjects who were regarded as dangerous were arrested. Martial law was declared in Egypt on the 2nd of November. In December, the absent Khedive was replaced by his nephew, and Egypt was proclaimed a British protectorate. The Khedive was well known that Khedive was pro-Turkish and had been in the Ottoman Empire when war was declared, which was for the British rather fortunate. The Ottoman Sultan, as head of the Muslim faith, declared holy war on Britain and France, hoping to encourage Muslim subjects in Africa and Asia to rise up against their colonial masters. The Sultan's call fell flat, but at the time the declaration caused considerable concern in Egypt and in India. On the 16th of November 1914, the Indian troops allocated for the defence of the Suez Canal arrived on the canal itself from India. These were 10th and 11th Indian Divisions. With them arrived Major General Alexander Wilson, who was made General Officer commanding Canal Defence by Maxwell. The arrival of these troops had been held up by the activities of the SMS Emden, which had been active as a lone raider in the Indian Ocean, even bombarding Madras in late September 1914. The opening shots of the war in Egypt came on the 17th of November 1914. A detachment of the Buccaneer Camel Corps were patrolling near Bir el Nus. As the men bedded down for the night, they were attacked by a group of Arab horsemen. The sentry fired his rifle to warn the sleeping Cameleers of the impending attack, but the Arabs managed to carry off a small number of the detachment, some of which managed to escape and return to Kantara on foot. 3 days later, on the 20th of November, a second detachment of the Buccaneer Camel Corps, under a Captain Chope of the 2nd Gurkhas, were attacked again by Arab horsemen. As Chope readied his men to face roughly 100 Arab horsemen in front of him, he realized that a similar number were massing behind him to envelop his detachment. Chope managed to get his men from between the two groups of horsemen and make it to higher ground under heavy fire. Upon reaching the higher ground, the Buccaneers regrouped and returned fire for around 5 minutes before retreating to the main road to Kantara. Once the Cameleers had reached the road, the Arab advance faltered and they resorted to long-range sniping. The Camel Corps was accompanied by Sudanese Cameleers of the Egyptian Coast Guard, but they appeared to have allowed themselves to be taken prisoner by the Arabs without resisting. Chope received the Distinguished Service Order for the action, and Sepoys Ali Khan and Faiz Ali Khan received the Indian Order of Merit and the Indian Distinguished Service Medal, respectively. The official history and contemporary dispatches state that Chope had 20 men with him, but his own report states it was 44. 1 Indian officer and 12 other ranks were killed during the skirmish, and 3 sepoys wounded. This would suggest Chope's own figure is more accurate to accept than the official figure, because if we accept that, it would mean that Chope finished the fighting with just 4 able-bodied men. This instance was also taken by Alexander Wilson to highlight the unreliability of the Egyptian Coast Guard against their co-religionists, the Ottomans. The Coast Guard had been officered by British officers prior to the war, but these had been transferred elsewhere to meet shortages. The Egyptian officers who replaced them had neither the training nor the experience to do so. If I can just briefly divert to talk about the Indian Army, because it is, of course, the Indian Army, Indian troops that would bore the brunt of the coming Ottoman attack. Indian troops had been involved in Wolseley's campaign in 1882 and also the ill-fated attempt to relieve Khartoum, and then also at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Yet service outside of India, particularly as far west as North Africa, was not a regular experience for an Indian Army soldier. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, the Army of India's main defensive concern was the hilly country of the northwest frontier of India, which presented unique military challenges. And I think from the picture on screen of the picket, you can see the hilly country involved. As such, there was no formal learning processes for the men who defended this frontier, Knowledge of how to fight on the frontier was simply passed on. Firstly, the ways and means of hill warfare were passed on and learned on the job during periods of fighting against local tribesmen who inhabited the frontier. Alternatively, when there was a lull in the fighting, mock battles would be arranged. One regiment would attack as if a native lashkar or war party, and another would defend using their usual tactics. Kitchener's arrival in India as Commander-in-Chief in 1902 saw a surge in reform. Kitchener felt he had to prepare the Indian Army to face potential Russian invasion through Afghanistan. The objective would be to keep a Russian advance at bay until British Army reinforcements could reach the subcontinent. This was a regular war the Indian Army were not prepared for. Kitchener began by renumbering the Indian Army regiments consecutively, disbanding those perceived to be the least efficient, and replacing with new regiments raised in the more martial north of the country. At Quetta, a staff college was set up and run in a similar manner to Camberley. This staff college helped the officers of the Indian Army absorb the lessons of the Boer War, in which they had not been a part. From 1900, 2 new types of military manuals were produced. The first of these concerned regular warfare and was based mainly on the British experience in South Africa. The second was for the northwest frontier and based largely on the Tirah campaign of 1897 and 8. With these new instructions distributed, Kitchener was able to reform the Indian Army training from regimental levels upwards. He introduced tests under active service conditions to assess a regiment's ability for war. When Kitchener arrived in India, regiments were unevenly equipped. The continually lingering spectre of the Great Rebellion of 1857 meant that the authorities of the Raj had maintained a policy whereby potentially mutinous Indian troops were armed with inferior weaponry to their British counterparts. Kitchener saw to it the Indian soldiers were issued with the Lee Metford rifle to replace the outdated Martini Henry they were issued with at the time. These changes were designed to make the Indian Army more efficient, as it lagged behind its British counterpart. Kitchener's input certainly reinvigorated the Indian Army, but the emphasis both of training and planning was always kept on the defence of the northwest frontier and the pacification of the unruly tribesmen that lived there. Interestingly, the significance of the Suez Canal would not have been lost on a British officer of the Indian Army. Whether heading out to India for the first time or heading to and from Britain on leave, their transports would have travelled along the canal, more often than not stopping at Port Said along the way, having already stopped at Gibraltar and Malta. The period between the German and Austro-Hungarian declarations of war and that of the Ottoman Empire saw Egypt used as a staging post for troops from India heading to France and Belgium. Captain Rowley Grimshaw of the Poona Horse was on leave in Britain when war broke out. He was ordered back to India to retake its post. Grimshaw's regiment, though, was earmarked for service in Europe, and so he was able to meet them in Egypt. He spent around 6 weeks in Cairo before sailing for Marseille with his squadron. Grimshaw found the August climate of Egypt to be similar to that of Bombay, and Cairo to be much like Calcutta, if the British aspects of Calcutta were substituted for the French influences in Cairo. There was a social club and a sports club where Grimshaw could play squash. Social clubs played a large role in the social lives of Indian Army officers on the subcontinent. And for the men who would defend the canal, the Suez Canal Company made every officer of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force an honorary member of their club at Ismailia. When in Cairo, Grimshaw was able to visit the museums and see ancient mummies on display. He found the exhibition of dead bodies to be distasteful. A couple of days later, he visited the pyramids and the Sphinx. Grimshaw didn't enjoy that either particularly, describing the structures as dilapidating and claiming in his diary that the Ellora caves of northern India were a far better representation of our forefathers' skill and energy. In comparison, Norman Dunkley, a territorial private in the 10th Manchesters, found the pyramids and the Sphinx fascinating. He made several visits and even got to get involved in an archaeological dig. He was glad to be able to see more of the world than, in his words, damp, dreary Oldham. Similarly, Thurston Holland Herbert of the Hertfordshire Yeomanry noted in his diary that he regularly undertook expeditions, as he called them, into Cairo in his civilian clothes, visiting the pyramids and several mosques. Indian soldiers, as I said earlier, may have seen some action in Egypt in 1882 and in 1898, but the First World War brought Indians and Egyptians into contact with each other on a scale not seen before. Indian soldiers not only mingled with local Egyptians, but also with Indian soldiers of other castes and religions. While serving in India, castes would be kept separate and officers would try to ensure that their men's religious sensibilities were not offended. In Egypt, as with other parts of the world during the war, this just couldn't be achieved. And many soldiers had to abandon their religious and social values and sensibilities. As one soldier noted, there is no doubt that I have not practiced abstinence because I could not continue to remain hungry. In Egypt, not only I, but a number of other Hindus, some of whom formerly have rejected the food if only a shadow of a passerby had fallen on it, have eaten from the hands of sweepers. Had we not done so, there would be no alternative but starvation, which could not be tolerated. Being in close proximity to Turkey encouraged a small number of Muslim soldiers to desert and attempt to cross the Sinai. In late December, 4 Katok Pushtun men deserted. And this occurred on the night of the 23rd of December. A cavalry search party was dispatched but failed to bring the men back. 8 days later, another 4 Katok attempted to desert, and this time they were picked up by the search party. A summary court-martial was found all 4 men guilty of desertion and sentenced them to death. The sentence was confirmed on 3, whilst the other had his commuted to penal servitude for life. There were no further reports of desertion for at least 2 months, suggesting that the capture and execution of the men served as an example to other Muslim soldiers in Egypt, discouraging further attempts to abscond. Rowley Grimshaw may have found the Egyptian climate very favourable in August, but by December and January 1915, the Indian troops found themselves short of warm clothes. Indian units in France had sailed without the same warm clothes, and the Indian Soldiers Fund had been set up as a charity to raise money in Britain to send send warm clothes and other supplies across the Channel to Indian soldiers on the Western Front. The Egyptian winter was perhaps mild in comparison to Northern Europe, but the temperature dropped significantly at night. The Secretary of State for India, the Earl of Crewe, and the Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, had to request that some of the supplies being sent by the Indian Soldiers Fund be diverted to Egypt. Sport was a really important part of Indian Army life. Officers actively encouraged their men to partake. And the most obvious benefit of sport is, of course, the promotion of physical exercise. It also promotes aggression and masculinity and helps build team morale and esprit de corps. The Indian units in Egypt were no different. Even as the Canal Defence Force began to prepare for the defences, the amusement of the troops was not neglected. A football tournament was arranged for the 4 Gurkha battalions in Egypt, was organised in January 1915. The 1st 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles defeating the 1st 7th Gurkha Rifles in the final. Their reward was a bronze Sphinx trophy, which found its way to the 5th Gurkha's mess in Abbottabad. Similarly, at Heliopolis camp, where the bulk of the Territorials were garrisoned, gas and then electric lighting was installed. For the men of the East Lancashire Division, this meant that they could enjoy sports such as rugby in the cool of the evening by artificial light. The Gurkhas may have been serving outside India and Afghanistan for the first time in their history, but sport remaining a constant would have kept the upheaval to a minimum. Likewise, the East Lancashires were still able to play sports they'd have been familiar with in civilian life pre-war, and again that offers a form of continuity. Ottoman scouts even reported seeing officers and men playing football on the banks of the canal, as the main body of the Turkish force was as close as 15 miles away. The Ottoman entry into the war and the arrival of 10th and 11th Indian Divisions, though, provided stimulus for the improvement of the canal defences. The canal was a natural obstacle for any army to cross, so it was used as the main defensive line. The main British defences were on the western or African side of the canal, with advanced outposts on the Asian side. The defences constructed were simple in comparison to those constructed later in 1916. The purpose of the outposts on the eastern side were to protect bridgeheads, so that if necessary, troops could get across to the eastern side quickly. These posts were dug into the ground and revetted with sandbags. The most elaborate outpost was at Ismailia, which you can see there on the map. This was to act as the main bridgehead in the event of a counterattack. Floating bridges were created using boats of the Suez Canal Company to further aid the crossing of the canal if necessary. On the western bank, trenches were dug where possible. Portions of the desert were flooded to prevent those areas coming under attack. Indian troops spent considerable time in December 1914 and January 1915 digging trenches and strengthening the earthworks. The war diary of the 93rd Burma Infantry, for example, makes more references to working parties than it does to training. The canal was divided into 3 sectors, 2 of which you can see on this map. The first of these was from Suez to the Bitter Lake, down at the bottom. The second ran from Devaswar, north of the Great Bitter Lake, to El Fadan. The final zone was from El Fadan, north to Port Said. The headquarters of the Canal Defence Force was positioned at Ismailia. The Great and Little Bitter Lakes covered 22 miles of the canal. Lake Timsah a further 7. These areas were natural boundaries for the 3 sectors, and attacks against the lakes would be highly impractical, and so they were lightly defended. The 10th and 11th Indian Divisions were given the responsibility of defending the canal, and these divisions would usually contain a British battalion, but this practice was abandoned to meet the demands of the war elsewhere. The troops of the East Lancashire Division were left behind the lines to continue their training. The division's 2 artillery brigades, though, were included in the defensive scheme for the canal, as was a pack gun battery of the Egyptian army. This would be the only Egyptians involved in the defence of the canal. Australian and New Zealand troops under William Birdwood were also left behind the lines to continue their training, having not long arrived in the country. 3 Morris Farman aircraft and 3 pilots were dispatched from Britain to Egypt upon the outbreak of war with the Ottomans, in order to assist in the event of an attack against the canal. One of these pilots, Captain S.D. Massey, was seconded from the 29th Punjabis, as he had formerly been the commander of the Indian Central Flying School. From these humble beginnings would sprout the Middle East Brigade, which went on to play a large role in both Mesopotamia and Palestine. Further aircraft were supplied from India minus the engines, along with mechanics again from the Central Indian Flying School. The pilots and engines for these craft were sent from Britain. Demands elsewhere meant that the authorities in India couldn't dispatch any further aircraft from India, but one craft was sent to Egypt, gifted to the military by the Rajah of Rewa. The Rajah's plane was accompanied by Captain Riley, which again, you guessed it, was from the Indian Central Flying School. He was the pilot. These aircraft were able to survey the whole length of the canal at 4,000 feet. Reconnaissance of the Sinai itself was a little bit more difficult. From Ismailia, the portions of the Sinai opposite Port Said and Suez were some 50 miles away, which was over half the flying time of a Morris Farman. The RFC had to create a system of advanced landing grounds in the desert, This greatly extended the range of aerial scouting. Meanwhile, French seaplanes were able to keep track of Ottoman movements and build up in Beersheba. This aerial observation kept Maxwell and Wilson very well informed. When time allowed to prepare for an attack against the canal, just as they would have prepared for an attack on the northwest frontier, the Indian units staged mock battles. For example, on the 17th of January 1915, a field day was held for the 11th Division. Two infantry battalions of the 31st Brigade and two squadrons of Imperial Service Cavalry made up White Force. 3 battalions of the 32nd Brigade and 7 squadrons of Imperial First Service Cavalry made up Khaki Force. White Force were to defend the canal from attack by Khaki Force. White Force was successful and the mock battle was followed by a debrief. Similarly, Brigadier General Cox, commander of the 29th Indian Brigade, tested the defensive scheme for Kantara by having the 14th Sikhs attack whilst the remainder of the brigade defended their post. The war diaries state that the defenders made a decisive counterattack. If we now look at the opposing side, the Ottomans had not initially envisaged a multi-front war involving Britain. For their allies in Berlin, however, cutting British communications with India was of great importance. To strike at the British in Egypt and cut their communication with Asia and Oceania, a new army, the Fourth, was created and based in Damascus. Jamal Pasha, Minister for the Navy and one of the ruling triumvirate, was nominated to take command of this new Fourth Army and lead the offensive. Jamal arrived in Damascus on the 18th of November 1914, but it would take time for the army to be organised and for the Syrian road and rail systems to be improved. The build-up was not helped by the actions of British cruiser HMS Doris under Captain Frank Larkin. The Doris spent December 1914 and January 15 interdicting Ottoman supplies and communications on the Syrian coast. Telegraphs, railway tracks, bridges and locomotives were all destroyed, either by the Doris's guns or by landing parties. Jamal faced a difficult task raising this new Fourth Army. The Ottomans had unsuccessfully launched an attack against the Russians in the Caucasus region. This offensive, led by Enver Pasha, another of the ruling triumvirate, was an abject failure. Men were needed to reinforce this front and were also needed to protect Istanbul and the Bosphorus Strait. Jamal had to cobble together a force of regular soldiers from the Arab provinces and supplemented these with irregular troops such as Bedouin tribesmen. Jamal had about 50,000 men at his disposal, but 20,000 of these were required to remain garrisoning the Arab provinces. Another 5,000 to 10,000 would be needed to be kept as a reserve. So Jamal had to attack the Suez Canal about 25,000 men at most. Facing this relatively small Ottoman army was 50,000 British Indian troops, an armoured train, a number of warships, and the not inconsiderable obstacle of the canal itself. Jamal's plan relied on two important but very unlikely events. Firstly, Jamal hoped to take a small section of the canal by catching the British by surprise. Secondly, he hoped that this success would encourage the people of Egypt to rise up against the British. Jamal drastically overestimated the Egyptian sympathies for the Ottomans, their former masters. Despite the fact his plan was heavily optimistic, it was fully supported by Berlin. The Suez Canal The Suez Canal was not the sole means to get troops from India, Australia, New Zealand to the Western Front. But to take the canal or block it would significantly slow the British imperial supply chains. If Jamal could achieve his objective of surprise, take a portion of the canal, even if for a couple of days, It would enable the Ottomans to sink a number of ships in the canal, blocking it. And what's great about giving this talk now is we have a contemporary example of when the canal was blocked just a couple of years ago by the Ever Given, which shows what happens to the world's supply chains when the canal is blocked. The Ottoman Army Command was supplemented with a series of German officers. Chief amongst these was General Lehman von Sanders. Sanders had misgivings about an Ottoman attack in the Caucasus and likewise had misgivings about attacking the canal. Jamal, though, had a German staff of 6 officers at his disposal for the offensive. This included his chief of staff, Colonel Freiherr Kress von Kressenstein. It was he who organised the expedition and would be credited with the successful transporting of men and material across the Sinai. Kress was, according to the British official history, the soul of the offensive. The Ottomans made their crossing of the desert in just 7 days, moving only by night and staying well clear of the coastline, which was guarded by British and French ships. The largest problem for Kress and his fellow German staff officers was keeping a good supply of water. This was left in the hands of German Major Fischer, who had a train of some 5,000 camels carrying water across the desert. His task made a little easier by the fact the season had been wetter than usual, leaving wells quite full. Through German efficiency and a stroke of luck, there was never a shortage of water. By mid-January, reports from aerial reconnaissance began to show a build-up of Turkish troops and of activity in the Sinai. On the 21st of January, an advance party of around 700 infantry and 200 cavalry was sighted by aircraft. This prompted Wilson to command that the main defences on the western bank of the canal be manned. On the 26th of January, reports came in of Moya Harab, about 25 miles east of the Little Bitter Lake, being occupied by 6,000 Ottoman troops. Reports from elsewhere were received indicating that advance parties had exchanged fire with the enemy. Reserves began to be brought up in rear areas all along the canal. Royal Naval vessels HMS Swiftsure, Clio, Minerva and Ocean, and Royal Indian Marine vessel Harding, as well as 3 French ships, which, with my Potteries accent, I'm not going to try and name, all took up places on the canal and in its lakes along with some smaller craft. The canal was now closed each night and reopened each morning. Observations from the night of the 30th of January showed General Wilson where to expect the Turkish attack. The greatest build-up of troops was 9 miles east of the canal at Bir Habita, almost opposite Serapeum, which is directly in the middle of this map. For Wilson, the Ottoman intention was quite obvious. They intended to attack the central sector of the canal defences. The Ottomans began to make a number of probing attacks to gauge the strength of the defences. They clashed with Indian patrols all along the front. These probes made Wilson doubt his initial assumption as to which part of the canal might be attacked. As sophisticated as the RFC's aerial reconnaissance was, it was of little use at night. The Ottomans had made the move across the Sinai at night and would probably attack at night also. To remedy this, dogs were left chained at intervals on the Asian side of the canal. These quite literal guard dogs would bark at any approaching men. The central sector between the Great Bitter Lake and Lake Timseh was manned by 22nd Infantry Division, consisting of 62nd and 92nd Punjabis, 2nd 10th Gurkhas, and 2nd Queen Victoria's own Rajputs. Supporting them was 4 15-pound field guns of the Lancashire Territorials and 4 mountain guns of the Egyptian artillery. On the east bank, two companies of the 92nd Punjabis were stationed each at Tusum and Serapayam, and two companies of the Gurkhas at Devaswar. On the west bank, there were 11 posts of two platoons each. Each had a frontage of 600 yards, with sentries set every 200 yards. Jamel launched his attack after nightfall on the 2nd of February. The advance of the Ottomans had been held up by a strong and unexpected sandstorm. At around 3:25 a.m. on the 3rd, Punjabi sentries at Tusum could hear movement and voices in front of them. When loud chanting broke out, Major T.R. McLachlan led out a half platoon and a machine gun from the post and fired in the general direction of vague figures and shouting. Fire was returned, but the fighting petered out in the darkness. The chanting is likely to be from Arab soldiers undertaking a pre-battle ritual against orders. Interestingly, the Ottoman attack on the canal was the first action for a man who would return to North Africa during the Second World War. The then Captain Claude Auchinleck and his regiment, the 62nd Punjabis, were mobilised for overseas service on the 28th of October. Initially earmarked for France, in early November they were informed of a change of destination. The 62nd, as part of 22nd Brigade, were to defend the Timps of Bitter Lake section of the canal, and it was this section that was to repulse the main Ottoman attack. Transport complications meant that the 62nd did not arrive at their final defensive position until the 23rd of January 1915, just 11 days before the Ottomans attacked. The Ottomans had carried or dragged on wheels a number of boats with which they intended to cross the canal. These craft, manufactured in Constantinople, were of galvanized steel. They were 24 feet long, 5 feet across. They could hold between 20 and 30 men each. Pontoons had also been brought across the desert, but these were for use after the defenders had been forced back and the canal had been taken. These were all found abandoned about a mile east of the canal after the attack had been repulsed. As the sandstorm died away and the clouds lifted, moonlight revealed the Turkish forces. Australian war correspondent, later the Australian official historian Charles Bean, wrote a vivid account of this early action. He said, midnight was past, but about 3 a.m., a sentry on the western bank, just south of Tusum Station, saw some men on the other bank launching a boat. He fired and immediately other troops on the western bank let fly at it. There was an instant uproar. Several machine guns and hundreds of rifles broke the silence with continuous fire. Other dark objects could be seen putting off into the canal. An Egyptian battery ran 2 rounds of case shot into one boat at point-blank range. A naval picket boat with quick-firing guns in the bows sank a boat by ramming it and opening fire at close range. The Egyptian battery was placed on high ground on the west bank and was able to rain shells onto the now illuminated Turkish masses. The attackers had managed to launch about 20 of the steel boats into the canal. Only 3 reached the western bank. One of these craft landed in the vicinity of Auchinleck's 62nd Punjabis. He recalled, our men charged down the bank and put the bayonet into them, which I think is very Corporal Jones. Most were killed or captured. Around 20 of the crossing party hid under the west bank and were later rounded up by the Rajputs in daylight. Torpedo boat numbers 043 and the Mansoura, an armoured tug commanded by a lieutenant of the Indian Marine, were dispatched from Ismailia to attack the Turks as they punted across the canal. The official narrative notes that this was accomplished satisfactorily, using gunfire and explosives. Morning light revealed the Turkish crossing party in disarray. Boats and pontoons abandoned. The men of the Ottoman 73rd and 75th Regiments, which had attempted the crossing, were scattered too. Many were sheltered opposite to some in trenches on the eastern bank, which had been abandoned by the Indians overnight. Several counter-attacks were launched by the 92nd Punjabis to clear these. Fighting continued until the afternoon. Eventually 7 Ottoman officers and 28 other ranks were led away as prisoners. Ottoman units still, though, lurked elsewhere on the Asian side of the canal. Confident that no attack was coming from the south of Serapeum, Gehagen, commander of the 22nd Brigade, collected men to cross the canal and advance up the east bank towards Tusum. He hoped to force the Turks to withdraw or push them onto the guns of the defenders at Tusum. This didn't work out as planned, however. 2 platoons of Rajputs and 2 companies of the 92nd crossed the canal, but were met by a strong contingent of Turks, supported by 2 batteries of artillery. They had their own objective. The Ottoman force began to advance towards Serapeum. Their own advance checked, the Punjabis and Rajputs moved to face the Ottomans, joined by 6 platoons of the 2nd 10th Gurkhas, and supported by fire from 2 of the French vessels. This small Indian force managed to hold the Turkish advance about 1,200 yards from the canal. Diversionary attacks were also made elsewhere, but these were ineffectual. In the far south, a half-hearted attack was launched at Al-Kubri, but this was easily forced back. At Ismailia and the northern end of Lake Timseh, an attack was made after the first light, but this was held off with machine gun and small arms fire. These feint attacks weren't made with enough vigour to fool Wilson into thinking a larger attack was coming elsewhere. RIMS Harding engaged in a long-range artillery duel with an Ottoman howitzer battery. Fire initially fell short of the Harding, but eventually the Turkish artillerymen found their range. High explosive shells hit both the Harding's funnels, and another exploded on the foredeck, causing casualties. The Harding had to make its way to Lake Timseh to avoid being sunk by the Ottoman artillery. The French vessel Requiem moved up to fill the gap left by the Harding, and the French ship ultimately silenced the howitzer battery. HMS Clio had a similar duel further north at El Fadan. A number of small skirmishes took place during the night of the 3rd of February, but by morning light on the 4th, it was clear that the attack had been halted. Detachments of Indian troops were dispatched to the Asian side of the canal to clear out the remaining Ottoman soldiers. A number of firefights ensued, but each time the Indians overcame the Ottoman resistance. Imperial service cavalry followed the retreating Turks, and there was a number of clashes with the Turkish rearguard. Wilson, though, wisely decided against launching an offensive against Jamal's retreating force. There was no convoy or transport system in place to get water and supplies across the Sinai for a counter-offensive to be effective. The RFC, though, was able to bomb the retreating force. With their characteristic thoroughness and efficiency, Jamal's German staff had provided for everything in advance. From prisoners taken during the attack, British intelligence learned that the German officers had already picked a hotel out in Cairo, where they were to dine after a successful attack. Some prisoners even suggested that the menu had been prepared in advance. One of the German staff, Major Wilhelm Karl von dem Hagen, died whilst leading a contingent of Ottomans against the canal. His body was found 2 days later by the British and buried. Possibly to deter vandals, the British covered the grave in barbed wire. The cross you can see was made from oars, which were used by, or supposed to be used maybe, by the Ottoman crossing parties. Major von dem Hagen now rests in the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery at Ismailia. In total, the British, Indian and Egyptian force lost 32 men killed and 130 wounded. according to the official history. Ottoman numbers were a little more hazy. They lost around 800 killed or wounded and a further 700 taken prisoner. When I was looking for a way into this topic when writing a book chapter, I came across this line by Charles Caldwell in his book on the Gallipoli campaign. The defence of the Suez Canal tends to be treated as a prologue for either the Dardanelles, the Palestinian campaign, or both. Caldwell's observation is not strictly true. Pre-war regulars these men may have been, but the Indian Army had no experience of fighting against regular soldiers, armed with rifles and artillery of a similar caliber to their own. Most of the troops in Egypt had only experience of warfare on the northwest frontier. Most of the troops in Egypt, some such as Auchinleck and his unit had no prior experience of battle. Considerable time was lost either through transport problems or to labouring on the earthwork defences. These regulars had to work with less experienced territorial and Egyptian artillery, and were assisted by a patchwork air force, which was still a fledgling military arm in 1915. As with other campaigns of the First World War, Indian soldiers, who were used to having every religious and caste requirement being met and provided for, put up a stout defence of the Suez Canal, despite having to abandon their spiritual and class sensibilities. Despite such handicaps and upheaval, the men of the 10th and 11th Indian Divisions applied their learning and development techniques taken from the northwest frontier with successful outcome. The Indian contribution to the war on the Western Front in 1914 and 15 has been well documented and given much publication in recent years. In France and Flanders in 1914, the soldiers of 3rd Meerut and 7th Lahore Divisions first saw action when they were required to plug a gap in the Allied line. In Egypt in late 1914 and early 1915, just such a gap appeared, a gap in the British Imperial defensive line, the cause of which was the demand for men and resources to fight the Germans in Europe. Had Jamel's force managed to take a portion of the canal, even for a short period, it would have had a detrimental effect on the British Empire's war effort. No other attempts were made on the Suez Canal, though Kress von Kressenstein did keep a small number of troops in the Sinai, and they carried out fairly small-scale raids against the canal. But they were of little significance. But they did serve the purpose of keeping the British on their toes, and always just watching for a further attempt on the canal. The majority of the troops involved in its defence went on to serve either in the Gallipoli campaign and then Palestine or Mesopotamia. As I said earlier, the RFC planes in Egypt in 1914 and 15 went on to form the Middle East Brigade. The defence of the Suez Canal was an introduction to regular warfare for both Indian troops and the fledgling Air Force. If I have piqued anyone's interest either in the Suez Canal, the Indian Army, or indeed both, I could highly recommend this book, which includes a chapter 5, which is me, on the Suez Canal and the Indian Army's defence of it. Do look it up. It's now out in paperback at a very reasonable price, as it is published by Helium. And finally, if you want to contact me, there are my details. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. I've got a question from Alan Evans, who asks, I wonder if Adam could talk briefly about the use of aircraft in the attacks.
Aircraft weren't used during the attacks itself because the attack was launched at night. So they weren't much use there. Their main use became once the Ottomans began to retreat, because they could bomb the Ottoman rear guard and sort of, I guess, hasten that retreat by doing so.
Absolutely. Really a question for me next, I guess, which is, to what extent was this theatre of the First World War known about to a contemporary British, if you like, readership?
Good question. There are contemporary news reports, not in every sort of local paper, but it certainly receives some press at the time. It's interesting. Obviously, I mentioned Charles Bean. He wrote quite a lengthy piece, I think, for the Adelaide Advertiser. So the people of Adelaide got to know about the attack. Obviously, it's sort of fortuitous, perhaps, that he was just in the country with the Anzacs, even though they weren't involved, and got to write quite a lengthy piece. So yeah, there are, there is knowledge and sort of reports at the time, but obviously it's certainly a lesser theatre perhaps than what's happening in Northern Europe at the same time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. A couple of comments. John Azar, I think I'm saying your name correctly, John. Apologies if not. Who says no questions but great slides. And Elaine Batchelor says thank you, a very detailed and well presented talk.
Thank you very much.
Nisbet, excellent lecture. A question from Johnny Doyle. Are the deserters mentioned who were executed commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission?
That is a great question, which I don't actually know the answer to. It's always nice to get one of those, and I will now go and try and find that answer out.
Brilliant. Excellent. A comment here from William Anderson, who says, don't forget Colonel Cress's 1916 foray across northern Sinai with the goal of taking the canal for the north.
Yes, they did, but it was sort of didn't get to the canal as such. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Johnny Doyle has asked, was there any impact on Indian troops by the February 1915 mutiny in Singapore?
Wow, that's a webinar of its own. But no, essentially, Singapore, which is something I looked at in detail during my doctorate, was born of quite local conditions, local to Singapore, local to that regiment, the 5th Native Light Infantry. And actually what you get in letters home from Indian troops at the time generally is condemnation of the actions of the men of the 5th. During this sort of time of collective struggle, they put their own sort of needs first and fell victim, I think, somewhat to sort of pan-Islamic fervor that was occurring in Singapore at that time. So yeah, there's no connection, generally speaking. It is sort of a quite localized mutiny.
Right, thank you very much. Well, I think that is all of the questions that we have. So really, it just leaves me to say, Adam, thank you very, very much for coming along tonight and sharing your expertise on a fascinating and a little known part, I think, of the Great War.
Well, funnily, when I was sort of asked to contribute to the book I put on screen, I chose this without knowing anything really about the campaign or the defense of the canal, and I very quickly realised how much is actually written on it, which made for an interesting if difficult research period.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Great. Okay. So for everybody else, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope we'll see you again on another webinar shortly. And again, thanks to Adam.
Thank you very much.
Mademoiselle from Armentières Park.